So, welcome to the National Women in Transport Networking Lunch. My name is Mina Dimitriou. Some of you may know me. I'm the project manager for this initiative, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Just a few housekeeping rules for today. If you could just please put your phones on silent, that would be great. If you need the bathrooms, they're just in the foyer where you entered over there. And I think that's pretty much it. It'd be greatly appreciated. Oh yeah, I said that. Now to introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to introduce our National Transport Commission CEO, Michael Hopkins. Please welcome Michael to the stage.
Thanks, Minna, and good afternoon to you all, and thanks so much for joining us. It's my pleasure today to introduce today's lunchtime speaker. And to start with, I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Today's event is a celebration of the National Women in Transport initiatives, including the Speaker Bureau, and an opportunity for people to get to know each other. It's great to see some familiar faces here and some new ones as well. And for those of you, and thanks especially to those of you who are able to bring emerging leaders and rising stars from within your respective organisations. This is a tradition that started at the first event back in December last year, and one that we'd like to continue. And to those emerging leaders, I'd just like to add a personal message. I hope your career in transport is as weird and wonderful and rewarding as mine has been. But it is important that people at the beginning of their careers get exposure to these events and have the opportunity to network and meet new people. So I hope you enjoy today. So why are we here? Transport is the third most male-dominated industry in Australia. With the industry forecast to grow by 6% over the year between now and 2026, we need to attract 40,000 new people into transport every year. To meet this demand, we urgently need a diverse and skilled workforce for our long-term sustainability. Creating a modern, diverse and inclusive transport industry demands leadership at the most senior levels of transport, and we need support from everyone to make the change. We need to break down the stereotypical perception of what a person in transport looks like and make opportunities for everybody. I think I'm from a time when everybody in transport looked like me, but older. And so it's great to sort of celebrate the diversity that we've got today, but knowing that there's still so much to do. As most of you know, the National Women in Transport Initiative is a partnership between government and industry to showcase, support and increase the number of women working in the Australian transport sector. The initiative was agreed by Australia's transport ministers back in May 2021 and was launched in March the year after by the National Transport Commission. Since its launch, the initiative has grown rapidly with strong and active online presence, several co-hosted events and activities to support women, including industry scholarships. But most of you will know what we're here for. Most of you will know us for our flagship initiative, and the reason we're here today, the Speakers Bureau. The Speakers Bureau was set up to increase representation and visibility in public at professional events where there'd been a tradition of a panel discussion that involved 6 blokes who looked very much like me, and what Romilly Maddew from Engineers Australia told me was a manel. So the intention is that we do away with the curse of the manel. I'd like to. So when we started, we had 15 profiles of senior women in the transport industry. I'm very happy to say we're closer to 80 now. Speakers come from a range of modes and specialities, all with unique experiences and perspectives to share. I know there's a few of you in the room, and I'd just like to welcome and say thank you to all of our speakers who are here. But it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr Leonora Risse. Dr Risse is an economist. Is an economist who specialises in gender equity. She's Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Canberra and a Research Fellow with the Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and serves as an expert panel member on the Gender Pay Equity for Fair Work Commission. She formerly held roles with Women in Public Policy program at Harvard University and at the Productivity Commission closer to home. She earned her PhD in economics from the University of Queensland, and today Dr Risse will share her expertise and discuss the road to gender equality, what hazards are blocking the way. As Minna mentioned earlier, there'll be some time for questions at the end of Dr Risse's presentation, so please join me in welcoming Dr Risse to the stage.
Well, thank you very, very much, Michael and Minna, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be joining you, and thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning on this special event. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're gathered here today as well. So when Minna invited me to come and speak, my first thought is, what can I say that people in this room don't know already? You're working in a traditionally male-dominated field, so you are probably well attuned to some of the challenges, some of the biases and barriers that still prevail. I'm from the field of economics, so I relate. It's a male-concentrated field as well. So we share that common experience of being passionate and enthusiastic about the work that we do, wanting to be role models and inspiring mentors for the next generation of women coming through, and for a more diverse community as well. But we generally can be well attuned to the biases and barriers and the roadblocks that still stand in the way. So I thought with today's presentation, what I would do is share with you some of the research insights that I've gathered up as part of my ongoing research into gender equality that are relatable and apply to transport, but also apply to the workforce more broadly. And as I was discussing with Minna, this topic is very well to say, yes, this is what we need to do to create a more inclusive, diverse, equitable workplace and culture and industry. We know what's on paper, what we need to do, but putting into practice can be such a hazard, such a dilemma, such a challenge. So what I'm also going to touch on today is some of that resistance, some of that pushback, some of that real struggle that we can encounter. And Minna's given me this microphone because it means I don't need to stand here like a university lecturer, and I think I can move around a little bit more. Can you hear me okay? Let's see if that's working. Is that working okay? Great, okay. The main storyline for today is road to gender equality, and what are some of those hazards that are getting in the way. So I'm going to start with this nice, cute little illustration that comes all the way from the 1970s, right? So this gender stereotypical impression and script of society. Boys are the ones who play with the trucks and girls have the dolls. Now, we like to think that these gender stereotypes, these gender patterns are long gone, that we've moved on, right? The issue is that the legacy effects of some of these ways of thinking still linger. They still infiltrate our policies, our decisions, that implicit response. Some of these are really quite alarming. Apparently boys are the ones that invent things. They have all the intellectual capital, and girls just luxuriously make use of what the boys have invented. And the boys build the houses, the girls keep the houses, the boys are fixing the things, and the girls need things fixing, right? So this is published. This is still was quite legitimate back in the day. The thing is that these attitudes still prevail. So we have information where we've surveyed as the Australian community as recently as last year. These surveys are ongoing. And it's not a majority view, but it's a sizable proportion of the Australian population who still subscribe to what we call the traditional male breadwinner, female caregiver role. It might look like a relatively small proportion, but it adds up to still a big part of the population, almost one fifth, 1 in 5. believe it is better for men to be the breadwinner and for women to look after the household and the children. And we have a sizable proportion here. 8% of Australians believe it is not good for a relationship if the woman earns more than the man. It can destabilise those traditional gender roles when men out-earn their partner. So why does this matter? So you of all people will understand how you're stepping into a male-dominated space, and these legacy effects can still be there in terms of the way work is organised, your rosters, the equipment, the uniforms, the expectations, who puts their hand up as a volunteer, who takes particular roles. Those gender patterns still linger, even unconsciously. It also means that as women, you are being very brave in stepping into what is traditionally a male-dominated space. All women who step into that, into any traditionally male arena, are doing something quite brave because you are breaking a mould, breaking a gender norm. And yes, it's fulfilling and it's rewarding. And there are so many positive aspects of that job and that opportunity, but it also brings biases and potentially backlash, brings hazards. What I'm going to share with you is a bit of a journey of how gender equality policies have progressed over time. And we can start to see a bit of a narrative. And a general observation here is that some of those early policies were really trying to scoop up more women and drop them into an environment that was quite biased, rather than trying to undo the biases that exist in the first place. So if we think back to, the 1950s, 60s, this was a real flourishing time of equality for women and rights. And legislation was changed, key laws were changed that really eliminated some of those pre-existing gender biases. Did you know that up until the 1960s, if you were a woman working for the public sector and you got married, you weren't allowed to keep your job? That was the Commonwealth Marriage Bar. It was designed to ensure that women were dedicated full-time to their family. That was law in Australia until the mid-1960s. So you had all these laws come into place, actually specifying women, you can earn the same rate of pay as your male colleagues. Up until then, it was only a fraction, a portion. We had the Sex Discrimination Act, right? So we had all these great, more than great, but momentous changes that really created the impression that it's an even playing field. The thing is that a lot of those implicit biases still linger. So you might hear some people say, oh, no, we're not discriminating against women anymore because the law says we can't. You have to pay men and women the same. Yes, the law says that, but in reality, we know there are still these biases in place. What this has really given rise to is this booming industry, the girl power industry, which is great. It's really motivating. It's what young girls, women of all ages need to see and hear, right? A lot of it is very commercially oriented. So there's perfume, there's t-shirts. I mean, this is great for affirming the message, but we also need to question, if we are telling girls they can do anything, are we also nurturing a society and a workplace where everyone agrees that women can do everything and are happy for girls to do everything? Are the men okay with girls coming in and doing anything? And then this notion that it's an even playing field, we're not allowed to discriminate against men and women, also means that we live with the aspiration, as we should, that everything is decided in a meritocratic way, that it's your talents, it's your skills, it's your ability that determine where you end up in life. And that's an incredibly important principle to live by. What we've found in the research is that organisations that go out of their way to call themselves meritocratic tend to be the ones that show greater favouritism towards men over women. So it's almost like they have to go out of their way to try to convince themselves that they're acting in a merit-based way. and they're not attuned to the implicit biases that are still there. So whenever you hear these types of statements, which is the best person for the job, there's no such thing as the gender pay gap, it's against the law, your success depends on your hard work. Yes, we probably all agree that we aspire to those things, but it can mean that our shutters are up. We are blind to the implicit biases and barriers that still exist. So then following on from that equal playing field approach, what we saw in recent decades is the boom of the lean-in approach. The reason why women were behind, why there were fewer women in leadership, fewer women in decision-making, women had lower earnings, was because they weren't leaning into the opportunities. They weren't putting themselves around the table. There's a lot of goodwill here, a lot of great intentions. It's there to empower women. But it almost suggests that the way that, the reason for the gender pay gap is that we've just been standing the wrong way. We need to put on a bolder pose, right? So a lot of effort's gone into supporting women to develop the skills that typify successful men, how to negotiate more assertively, how to stand up for yourself. And this is all fine and good. They're very valuable skills, but they're basically trying to attempt to shape women into the mould of a successful man in what is still a biased culture. So often, if you're in these negotiation skills training workshops, what you're being taught is how to be assertive, but then how to be aware of the double bind as a woman, that if you're too assertive, it can be seen as a negative. So you've still got to show a caring side, but also make sure you get paid what you deserve, right? So it's about navigating a biased system. And so women's time is taken up with all these sort of remedial classes where the men can just get on their job. The other issue here is women trying to move into male-dominated areas like STEM is basically a matter of women now stepping into what is traditionally a male field, but that industry not changing necessarily to be more inclusive, unless deliberate attempts are made. So you basically have more women going into what are traditionally male fields, but some of the research shows that the women who've gone into STEM fields compared to women who've gone into non-STEM fields have actually encountered more hostility, worse workforce satisfaction, because they've gone in thinking that they would have an equitable, promising career and haven't discovered that. And then we've had parental leave, maternity leave, which is basically setting women up to do a double shift. So you're carrying a briefcase in one hand and a baby in the other. Who's missing from this picture are men and fathers. They're not necessarily part of this shift to also be part of that caring space. And then we have the diversity training, where we're looking at how we can be attuned to some of these biases that exist by all coming in and having a 3-hour workshop, which is going to cleanse us from all the biases that we carry around over a lifetime. So really well-meaning, but it's all set up to try to navigate the system rather than starting to evolve and de-bias the system. So as I mentioned, some of the research behind this, some of the observations and comments I've shared with you are all backed up by some of these this research. So this is the one about the STEM fields, the women actually finding it's probably a more challenging environment to be in a STEM field than in a non-STEM field. We have this phenomenon called the glass cliff. Have you heard of the glass cliff? Where when women are appointed to leadership, more often than not, compared to the men, it's when the men really didn't want the job because the company is in crisis, or the political party's in crisis. So they're in a more challenging situation. And then there's this field of research that suggests that when you pressure women to negotiate, it can sometimes lead to worse outcomes. This notion that women just need to negotiate more assertively for their pay doesn't speak to the fact that sometimes women are really good at reading the room and telling ahead of time if that negotiation is going to be successful or not. How are they going to be received? Are you going to be seen as too ambitious? Could it backfire? So that brings me to a little piece of research that I did myself. So I have often been the recipient of this type of advice through high school, through uni. I know I was definitely one of the young women who was told, Leonora, you just need to be more confident. You're too shy. You're too quietly spoken. You just need to get out there more. And like many of my colleagues, it was all designed to help us to accelerate our careers, that we just need to negotiate more boldly, go for that promotion, don't hold back. So what that advice really speaks to is this field of this stream of research, like Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In book, that suggests that this lack of confidence is the reason why women are not getting ahead in the workplace. So as an economist, as a researcher, I managed to get hold of some data, the Hilda survey data, and it looks at people's workforce outcomes, their pay, their promotion, and in certain years, it collects this really fascinating data on their psychological personality traits. And one of those personality traits was confidence, your confidence to put yourself forward for a challenging situation where you might fail. So basically, what that little piece of data captured was this advice that Sheryl Sandberg is sharing with us. So what I did is I put it into the data. I'm a numbers person, so I looked at the model to see, is there a correlation? Is there a pattern here, an actual causal a relationship between a person's level of confidence and whether or not they were promoted in the next year? And in that model, what we can do is we can put in a whole lot of other information that could otherwise explain their promotion outcomes, like their education or their industry or their age. So we put all that into the model as well. So we're just teasing out this relationship between your level of confidence and whether or not you're more or less likely to get promoted in the next year, which would be consistent that this advice works. So what did I find? Well, yeah, that advice works. It's a beautiful upward trajectory here if you are a man. So this is what the data says, right? So from left to right on the horizontal axis here, we go from having a low level of confidence in your ability towards the right, having a high level of confidence. So it's rated numerically from 1 to 7. And then on the vertical axis is the predicted probability of a job promotion the following year. And we know that every year there's a certain number of promotions happening at any point in time. So this is about having a relatively higher likelihood of that occurring. And so if there is a positive relationship here, it would be consistent with that advice. That advice, yeah, that seems to pay off. For women, it flatlines. There is no relationship there, which is to say that even if you were more confident, it doesn't translate into a higher likelihood of job promotion. There's a whole lot of other factors at play for women. And the thing about the Lean In book is that there are so many cases of women who probably did try to lean in and it really didn't work. And so I did come across this one book by Marissa Orr where she worked at Google and she's like, here's the warts and all story of what I tried to do. And it's about being authentic as well. That's a big part of it. Are you authentically showing your true self? So some of that advice is shared by the women who used that technique, who were more confident, and it's great. It worked for them. But for a good portion of us, it's not us. It doesn't work. Or the environment we're in is not rewarding confident women. If you're going to encourage women to be more confident, you need a workplace that rewards confident women. And so then we followed down this track with the diversity training. So a little bit more about that. This is great. This was a real breakthrough because it alerted us to the way that people can make impulsive, instinctive decisions that are actually subjective. They're not completely objective. They've got they've got gender templates still swimming in their minds that are influencing who do they think of as a leader. When they have a job interview, they ask questions like, so which school did you go to? Which football team do you follow? So they're building this affinity with certain people. So if there's someone who's more diverse, who didn't go to that school or didn't follow that football team, subconsciously that can influence the outcome. So this diversity training, implicit bias training, has really cottoned on to something really important. The issue is how we are operationalising it. So some of this research has found that just having these initiatives in place can sometimes backfire if people don't genuinely believe that there is bias to begin with. There's not a need for this unconscious bias training. It hasn't necessarily been rigorously evaluated. So often we host these workshops, we do the training, we get a bit of input out of it, bit of knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily flow through to have a substantial, long-lasting effect unless there are other systems in place. Some of the research has found that it simply becomes a ticker box exercise, and it doesn't necessarily work for women who are from marginalised groups. So it could be the majority cohort, women from the dominant culture, ethnic group, region, but this is what we mean by intersectionality, where women who come from a different cultural background, who live with a disability, who come from a lower socioeconomic background, some of these diversity initiatives are not not effective for them. Some of this research is actually quite scathing and finds that if you compel people to sit in a diversity training workshop, it can even activate bias and backlash because people feel that it lacks, that there's no authentic engagement there. They feel like they're being forced to do something and the effects might not last. So where does that leave us? So I've got a bit of positive news now. So this is where the research is actually pointing us towards in terms of what is working, where is there hope here, and this is the harder stuff. This is relatively less resource intensive, less challenging. This is the more effective, meaningful, substantial change, but it takes more commitment, more effort, and more patience. So it's about, instead of trying to, we've ticked the box, dismantle overt discrimination, like, yes, we need the law to be on the side. This approach, equipping women to fit into an existing system, like add women and stir, is really a challenge for the women. Or expecting people to shed their ingrained biases through diversity training if you're not also changing processes and policies. So this third part is about cleansing the gender biases and the gender norms, those scripts, those templates from your system, and being alert to where they pop up in ways you may not have realised. So in summary, these are some of those actions. Thinking about those gender norms that constrain women, men and people of all genders. And a really, really big one here that I'm a really strong advocate for is promoting caregiving amongst men. This is incredibly important because there's no way we can expect more women to move into the workforce, into male-dominated sectors especially, if we're not also supporting men to be a part of the caring space and to legitimise that amongst men as well. And that caregiving role also can encourage more men to step into the caregiving professions in the workforce, like childcare, aged care, nursing, where we desperately need more workers as well. Otherwise, where are the women that you're hoping to step into transport, which sectors are they going to come from? If they're leaving nursing or they're leaving teaching, who's going to fill those jobs, right? So to achieve a balance and equity in any particular sector, you need to be looking at achieving balance and equity in all sectors. Placing a gender lens on all processes, policies and services, so conducting a gender analysis. So in budgeting, in government budgets, this is often called gender responsive budgeting. And it's something that the federal government's starting to bring back now. The Victorian government has embarked on it. Several other state governments are doing it. Australia actually used to be a leader in gender budgeting back in the 1980s. But what it's about is looking at your policy. So looking at how do you design your hours of work? How do you design your everyday policies and practices? How do you recruit? How do you write your job advertisements? Is there something in there that is still perpetuating old traditional gender patterns? Or are you doing things a little differently now to make it more inclusive, more expansive, so that everybody can be a part of it? What we do recommend is using data. So data can tell a very powerful story about the existence of gender gaps and can allow you to track progress over time. And this is the intersectional gender lens. So this is about ensuring it's not just more women, but women from diverse communities and men from diverse communities and backgrounds who are part of your picture. And sometimes with the intersectional lens, it becomes a matter of focusing on the data. The real takeaway is making sure you have diversity of voices in your decision-making processes. So who's on your committees? Have you gone out and engaged with stakeholders, with the users, with the beneficiaries of your services and programs and products? Do you have a representative cross-section of the community involved in that decision-making process? On the screen here, now I don't intend for us to work through every single one of these, and I believe you're going to have a copy of the slides available after as well. Happy for them to be shared. But here's an example when I keep referring to these little biases that creep in. This is what we mean. So that first one there, the current system. Imagine we have a job interview and we assume it's meritocratic. Where is that implicit bias stemming from? What's the source? It's something called affinity bias, this unconscious favouritism towards people who remind us of ourselves. And it can sway our decisions. You know what, this person feels like a better cultural fit, better fit for the organisation, right? I just felt like I gelled with them. It's probably because they come from the same sort of background as you, as opposed to what's the cultural add? What's the value add that this diversity brings as well? So what they recommend is we use structured interview questions and practical skills-based tasks. So we're trying to eliminate that subjectivity. A second one here, I'll jump to this third one on the row here. Leave it up to women to request higher pay. So if you just say to women, well, if you want higher pay, you've got to go in and negotiate for it. What we know is there can be that risk of backlash, that women are seen as being too ambitious, too assertive. The graph I showed you before shows that the evidence is not there to suggest that that approach pays off. There's a lot of research talking about that double bind. Instead, conduct a pay audit by gender. Look at the gender pay gaps in your organisation at every level. And if there is a gap, what is the rationale for it? And accountability, reporting it to the executive, reporting it to the board. So you're bringing in that transparency and that accountability. The data is the research is very strong, showing that it's organisations that invest in data and pay audits where they see a narrowing of the gender pay gap compared to the organisations that don't invest in that type of data. So one final one at the bottom here, this is a really practical one. Think about the way you describe your job or your company or your role. So much of it still carries these traits that are associated with masculinity. And they've got these little software apps now called language decoders or gender decoder, and you can put your text through this decoder and it can tell you, well, you've used a couple of words here that really are associated with masculinity, or maybe it's femininity, but something to something male, female concentrated. And so you can think, okay, those little subtle cues that our communications are sending out there, how can we ensure that that is free from these gender biases? Okay, so that's the what to do. This is the hard part, like how to go ahead with all of this. How can you be advocates for it? I can share with you this knowledge and help to empower you with information and knowledge. But advocating for this is really challenging because we know there is backlash out there, even in subtle ways, people just being indifferent towards it. So we're starting to amass evidence of this backlash. Here are some survey responses, and this is really informative and brave and helpful that these are survey responses from men who they're admitting that they're really not on board with some of these gender equality initiatives. And we need to hear that, and we need to work out how do we navigate this and ensure that we find a way for this particular cohort of men to feel part of that journey. Otherwise, it can really sabotage your efforts. So some of them feel like they're now actually the victims, that they're not, that they're being deprived of what should be a just and fair process. They feel like equality has gone too far for women. This survey came from a 2023 survey of Australians, so very recently, and they feel like men are now discriminated against. And I would say we need to take these responses really seriously. They're feeling that we're trying to make amends for decisions that were made in the past, and that current generation of men are now being deprived of their opportunities. And they might express that they're happy for women to advance, but not if it means men missing out. So there's some sort of caveat, some sort of condition there. And of course, this is not what we're aiming for. We're not aiming for it to be men feeling displaced or out of the picture. And so this brings us to the need to ensure that our gender equality approaches are looking for ways to expand opportunities for men so that they don't feel that their opportunities to succeed, to have purpose, are being encroached upon by competition from women. So we've said to women, yes, you can have a caring role and you can also step into the workforce. We haven't said the same for men. So for men, it's a shrinking territory. It's a feeling that the women are now our competition. How do we expand those opportunities for men to also feel purpose and achievement and success? There's some really startling research that's showing, this came from Australian surveys, Australian households, that when a woman begins to earn more than her male partner, her likelihood of experiencing domestic violence and emotional abuse increases. And the thinking behind this, the rationale behind this, is that because the male breadwinner, female caregiver norm has been toppled, has been destabilised. And so the women might feel empowered, but the male now feels deprived of that opportunity to have a purpose. How do we reassert that opportunity for that man to also find another type of purpose? So yes, coming back to this picture, where do the men fit in? So I'll just share with you quickly some of this research behind this is that what they've found is a link between the people who are the least supportive of equality and diversity, so the most resistant, the most against it, place a very high weight on these two values: conservatism, maintaining tradition, keep the status quo, and self-enhancement, an opportunity to pursue your own power and achievement. And so it kind of speaks to, this is the way we've always done things, why are we disrupting it? So this helps us to understand some of those responses. They see it as a threat to their own opportunities. And there's a stream of work looking at social identity. So we all are looking for some sort of purpose and fulfillment, whether it's at home, in our families, in our workplaces, in society. And so for some men, and for women too, conforming to those traditional gender roles is reassuring. It's like, I know I can be the main breadwinner, I can be the leader, I can be the executive, because I know society has legitimised that role for men. Society hasn't done a very good job of legitimising caregiving for men. So if they want to step into that space, there's this risk of stigma, this risk of not being respected by your peers, by being seen as weak. So it's about expanding roles and legitimising, giving validation to those roles for men. And finally, this really interesting stream of research, if you're interested, this is an online article from the Harvard Business Review. And it's identified that you can have these workplaces that have traditionally been male-dominated, and instead of people like turning up to do their job, that's the main purpose, turn up and do your job, really what they thrive off is this sense of asserting their masculinity. So showing no weakness, being tough and stamina, working incredibly long hours, working overtime, working Saturdays, working weekends at the expense of your family, because it's rewarded and celebrated by your workplace. It's a sense of achievement and validation. But it's incredibly unhealthy, and it's marginalising and ostracising to people who can't work long hours or can't stay back late. Okay, so it excludes women by default. So there's this whole notion that if you look carefully at a workplace, are you rewarding the people who can work excessively long hours? And if that's the case, are you excluding the ones who have family responsibilities? And that's part of what we call that traditional masculinity culture, because it's associated with these traditional masculine traits. What we've found in the research too is that men don't benefit from that type of extreme hyper-masculinized culture either. It brings a lot of pressure that is related to poorer mental health, depression, suicide, and acts of violence against women as well as against other men. And we know that a good portion of young children do wish that their fathers could spend more time with them. And many fathers wish that they could spend more time with their children as well. So there's all these reasons for us to change. And it's about expressing that case for change in ways that resonate with men at a personal level. Not just saying it's the business case, it'll make our organisation more profitable. It's about how it will also make men feel more connected and more holistically and healthily, achieve a more holistic and healthy balance as well. So on my final slides here, I'm not sure how I'm going for time. Okay. I thought what I'll do is put together, I've got 6 little dot points here, which try to sort of sum up, okay, what do we do? What do we do with all this information in a practical way? This might be useful for you in one way, one shape or form, to share with others when opportunities arise or to advocate for. That first point there is about the unconscious biases that are in our systems and our processes. And so instead of trying to de-bias people, all the biases we've carried with us throughout all our lives, how can we focus on de-biasing processes and systems instead? And that was that big blue table that I had there with all the examples. And there's a great book by an economist, behavioural economist, Iris Bonet. It's called What Works? Gender Equality by Design. And you can go online and you can read some of her work or listen to some of her talks. That second point is the gender lens. The gender lens. Apply a gender lens to all practices and processes. And one way to do that is ask this question: does this current approach reinforce those gender patterns, or does it help to dismantle them? So is your current parental leave putting the expectation that it's primarily women who are doing the leave, or is it helping to dismantle it and bring men into that parental leave picture as well? Data, invest in data metrics, and this isn't just about head counts. So what's really also coming through is that it can't just be about, oh, we're coming up to 40% or 50% of women. If those women aren't included in decision making, or if they're in roles that are holding the stop sign and not actually in, very meaningful, important decision making roles. And it's also about experiences. Do people feel safe? Do they feel included? A sense of belonging, voice and respect. And you can do that. You can run surveys to collate that type of information from your members and staff. Accountability. So it's one thing to say it, but if you insert gender equality as a KPI, that seems to really get things moving. Okay, so that's one practical strategy. The intersectional component, and this is where I'll encourage you to focus on the decision making, including you have diverse views in that deliberation, consultation, decision-making process. And the final one, where I've really tried to bring together some of that resistance piece and how do we act on some of those little snippets of research and turn it into something practical and actionable. So what I would recommend is articulating a case for change that resonates with everyone, including men. And I know one of the most common ways we talk about diversity is, it's good for business, it's good for the company, it's good for profits. But is that cutting through to the individuals? And Michael used the word earlier about being inclusive. And I think that's really, really at the essence of this as well, inclusive. So making sure that your case for change actually does include men in that picture as well. How can they benefit from this as well? How will it expand opportunities for them? So policies aimed at empowering women will only be effective in a culture that genuinely accepts and embraces women being empowered. So if there are people out there who feel threatened by women being empowered, who feel destabilised, then we're setting up a very hazardous situation here. Did you notice when men were expressing their aversion, their hesitancy to gender equality, they were expressing it in terms of the value of fairness. They felt that it was unfair to them. They felt it was unjust to them. They were being deprived of opportunities. It says a lot. It says that fairness is a very strong and powerful and moving value. How can we frame equity and diversity initiatives in terms of fairness in a way that resonates with men as well? So how can we evolve some of our processes, our care policies, for example, that highlights to men, you know what, you're actually missing out at the moment because we don't have parental leave policies that include men, and that's a bit unfair. And what we're going to do is expand it for men, and that's actually more fair for men as well. That's one way to leverage that value. And you might be able to think of others. And those social and professional roles for men, how do we legitimise it? So the use it or lose it component is super important because it legitimises it rather than saying, oh, it's up to you. You want to make it really clear that the community, the Australian society is behind you here. Your workplace is behind you. And then mental health and well-being. So I shared with you some of those facts about the risk of suicide, depression, because that speaks to the importance of policies for inclusion and diversity, not just being about broadening our skills or expanding our workforce. It's actually about mental health and well-being. And that should be a very strong motivator for any company and any culture, any work culture. So what you do have is a relationship between creating a more gender equitable, a more inclusive work culture and better mental health and well-being outcomes for all of your staff. And to me, that is one of the most powerful business cases for change. So do you remember our little cartoon? Boys have trucks. So this is about girls and boys, and indeed people of all genders, having trucks. And not just when they're young, but a society that genuinely and authentically is set up in a way that women can thrive in a world where they're driving trucks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leonora. That was an incredible presentation. I'm sure everyone in the room feels the same. We're extremely grateful. So thank you so much. We're going to break for about 10 minutes to do some questions. So if anyone has their first question, they want to shoot their hand up. My colleague Mark over here is going to walk around with a microphone. So if anyone has, we've got one at the back.
Thank you for that. I'm always reminded of the story of the orchestra where they're having violinists perform and they decide, okay, we're only hiring men. We're going to make it a blind interview. They walk out, they still hire only men. They realize it's that they heard the high heels walking across the stage, so they put carpet down, and then finally they start hiring evenly based on merit. When I love the idea of changing the system, and that definitely needs to happen, I'm just wanting to ask about the day-to-day management of people who do exhibit toxic masculinity, who are going to feel like they were tricked into hiring women because they didn't know they were female, or now they're forced that they have to pay them more even if they don't think they're deserving. Your steps that you listed had, I guess, bigger milestones when you'd be monitoring and tracking. I just wanted to ask if you had any evidence-based approaches, especially when women can be labelled troublemakers and nuisances for raising issues to HR. If men are going to derail the system by not being on board, it's unfortunately damning evidence to go, hey, look, women can't do this. Look, we followed all of your procedures. And look, it failed anyway. But it's because we weren't tracking, day-to-day things that affect quality of life.
Sure. Thank you, Emma. Thank you very, very much for sharing that and for the context and the orchestra example. You're right, how they thought it was visual and then it turned out to be the sound of the high heels as well that was the giveaway. I hear what you're saying, that some of this is still far off into the distance, and the day-to-day you're trying to do your job work is still a challenge because of those pockets of toxic resistance, whether overtly or indirectly. I think it is also about trying to get to that critical mass, this is why it's really important to bring in women, not just one token woman at a time, and expecting that to shift the culture, but bringing in a substantial number that this is really starting to signal a change in practice, and for that to be reinforcing as well. So that's part of the evidence base there, that it's really, really a challenge if you're counting on progressively one woman at a time. And then if you've got critical mass, then the women themselves and male allies, of course, and male leaders who are on board with this and get it, can play that reinforcement role to back each other up, to substantiate it. No, this is the way we're doing things, this is how we're changing our processes and policies. So I think that would be my initial suggestion there. But in some organisations, or if you're distributed across all different locations, you might actually have just a small number of staff, right? And so that critical mass dynamic is very, very hard to achieve. So I think you'd ideally want to try to tap into building that critical mass in other ways, in virtual ways. So you've got your support group, you've got your evidence base around you, if you like, rather than trying to do it on your own or expecting that woman to do it on her own. There's certainly still going to be cases of individuals, and sometimes it comes from women as well, who are saying, no, there's no need to change, right? And so that research piece about conservatism and wanting this to be, and wanting to hang on to the traditions and status quo can sometimes be, it can be informative in suggesting to us that bold and like leaps of change can be very intimidating to this cohort who want to hold on to how things are. And one way to express it is to say, look, we are evolving this legacy. So if they love tradition and conservatism, you say, you know what, we're not completely radically overhauling everything in these changes. We are progressively evolving our legacy, and you can be part of that legacy. So it taps into that notion of, we want to hold on to the past. We want to be proud of our past and our identity. We don't want to do away with everything. How do we do that? Make it substantial change, but make the narrative one of progression, so they feel like they're less threatened by change as well. That's where I think that conservatism value could be leveraged in a positive way. Yeah. Hope that helps. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And I really love the fact that you included the male care aspect as well, not just the female work aspect. Because I saw a brilliant quote not long ago that says, society did a great job of letting millennial girls know they could do anything. They just forgot to tell the boys what that would mean for them as fathers and husbands. So, and even in my own experience, the approach of my career and people's approach to me in my career since becoming a mother has definitely shifted, because my hours are shorter and I can't be one of the boys anymore. Have you got any data points to looking at women with care responsibilities and women without care responsibilities, and what that impact has on their success in their career?
Yes, so great question. So, motherhood, caring responsibilities certainly does, the evidence suggests that it does encroach on career trajectories and pay, and more so for women than for men. So you might even say there's a motherhood penalty and in some cases a fatherhood reward. So still speaks to those gender inequities. And my read of the research, I didn't put a slide in, but I had some sitting there that shows that women who have children are actually more likely to be discriminated against than women who don't have children, even when applying for jobs. So it's that unconscious bias. So the evidence isn't actually very comforting at the moment, which is why we need the changes in the system. And I think the more that men are involved in caregiving, the more it's normalised. I would also add not just caregiving for children, but caregiving for other family members with a disability and elderly parents. That's a huge part. It's going to become more and more intense. So the more that we normalise that as employers, as managers, understanding and legitimising that caregiving, then more and more people experience it and are more likely to be empathetic towards it, to understand it, to not let it have as much of an impact in your career as it does at the moment. But then also to think more holistically about reassuring everybody that your success and what you've achieved in your life is also, your caregiving is a big part of that as well, I think. Yeah. So hopefully those data points will improve in the future. Yes. Yeah, none of them is.
Good.
Natalie Pelham, Office of the National Rail Safety Regulator. Thank you very much for the talk. I thought it was really insightful and very helpful. And And a really good thing to see that, you know, we've had these changes over time in our approaches to the way in which we deal with this problem, and now getting to a point of going, let's not try to change women, let's try and change the system. And that really resonates with my own experience, and I'm sure that of others too. So the question I've got at the moment is, I'm working in an organisation which I think has gone through some of the stages that you're talking about, and I'm really interested to understand with this last approach, all of it, 2 through to 7 or 8, or whatever the points were, are about attacking the system and trying to take the biases out of the system. And I'm just wondering if there are some things that you would say do before you do others, because there's obviously a lot to tackle all at once. Are there a combination of things that you should look at early on? And I ask because I've come into an organisation and I raised the question earlier this year about what are we doing for International Women's Day? What are we doing for Reconciliation Week? And the answers I got were, we don't celebrate International Women's Day because it celebrates only one gender, so we don't do that here. And then we don't recognise Reconciliation Week because it only celebrates one culture, and we don't do that here. And I thought, wow, that's really quite an amazing thing to say, you know. And so I think when you're dealing with that kind of cultural workplace, and yet everybody in the workplace, if you ask them if we've got a fair work, oh yes, we treat everybody equally, we do all of this, we do all of that. So it's a tough gig, and I'm wanting to introduce particularly this, and I think all the research that I've read indicates if you make a place better for women, you make a place better for everybody. So what are the key things in that context that you might suggest are the best starting place?
Oh, yeah, excellent points. Thank you so much. I'm going to hopefully not forget everything you just said there.
Sorry.
No. There's a key point I just want to bring up too about International Women's Day and the notion of celebrating and Reconciliation Day and this notion of celebrating. So the origins of International Women's Day were about recognising the rights of working women, not one of celebration. And I think this, what you've described there, is this interpretation that has evolved over time, and you have commercial enterprises that, in a very well-meaning way, are sort of almost part of this industry. And so you've got an opportunity there actually to play an educational role and enlighten people to understand the origins of these causes for their own benefit as well, so they understand that this was about working women back in the early part of the 1900s, rather than celebrating women of today. And it's, you know, so that might be a way to manage that type of pushback that you're getting. In terms of, yes, where do you start with such a big and comprehensive and sometimes overwhelming list? I think with any strategic approach, you are looking for buy-in and commitment from leadership, and that has to come with resourcing as well. And so having that, often there'll be action plans and strategic plans, etc., but just setting up that institutional architecture is extremely important. And some of the models I've seen work really well are having like champions or ambassadors, but not sitting up onto the side in the HR department, but embedded and in multi-layers. So not just at the top either, but at mid-management and advocates at junior level too. So you've got it infiltrating, you've got it embedded. So yeah, it does not hinge on just one person as well. The data, or the research would also say the data is incredibly important as a starting point, because it gives you the picture, it gives you an objective picture to start with, rather than people saying, oh, we feel like this is unfair. It's hard to negotiate with or talk back to data, so that's often a really important starting point as well. And I would say my recommendation in terms of building a strategy would be set up your accountability mechanisms early on, rather than leave that to the end, because that shows a sign of serious commitment as well. But then also be patient with yourself that it is a journey. It is absolutely a journey. And some of the work I've done advising or in consultancy space too is reassuring people involved that if you are one of the people orchestrating the change, it is incredibly hard and challenging along the way, and that even building awareness is a milestone. It is absolutely a milestone. This gender lens and this gender impact assessment, the act of carrying out a gender impact assessment should be counted as a milestone even before you get to the resultant change. So just mapping out all of those steps as being progressive and counting for something, I think, is one way to realistically handle what you're doing as well. Thank you. Pleasure. Peace.
Probably have time for just one more question. Maybe Tricia? Yep, in the blue.
James. Thank you. I started work in 1970 for us, straight out of school in an age where I wasn't allowed to be a clerk in the railways, wasn't allowed to be a bank teller. I actually worked in a bank first, and if I got married, I had to ask the bank manager's permission as to who I was marrying. So it's a long time. We've come a long way. But one of the things that I would like to hear about is resilience, because women will continually have to be battling this over time, and we see small incremental stages. And the other thing I'd like to ask your opinion of is the role of other women. So for me, I've always had other women taking my hand and leading me through that. Now, as a woman with a disability, who's always had a disability, that's been very useful to me, maybe because I don't seem to be threatening to their careers. But really, other women support other women. And thank you for raising the disability, because we often get forgotten in the diversity lens.
Thank you. I mean, that's incredibly moving, and your stories may come from a long time ago, but they really still have such power and significance today. So don't feel like they're from another time. No, they're resilience. I think you probably embody resilience. The role of women supporting other women, I think one way that it's illustrated throughout society in Australia is so many not-for-profit community groups. There's the National Foundation for Australian Women. Women are really, really good at mobilising and supporting each other with very, very minimal resources. You have the Victorian Women's Trust here, you have the Women's Health Services. They have a way of pulling together, and not in a competitive way, but in a really genuinely collegial, supportive, intuitive way. I hear you there, and I think that is a great and powerful source of energy for that resilience, and that coming back to not doing it on your own, I think. So not the token woman. There's no way any of this can be achieved in isolation. It is about the power of coming together as a community. And through my affiliations with some of the women's groups, that is really where they synergize. They bring together each other's experiences and values in a way that's bigger than the sum of the individuals. Australia has a remarkable history of women's groups. It's really important that history is documented as well, and your initiative, Mina, is part of that. You are part of that, and often it might be sector specific or identity specific in a way, or location specific, but women are out there as well. I think they also do mobilise when it comes to election time, and so more and more they will carry a voice for what policies need to be changed as well, whether it's locally, state, corporate. So they can wield a lot of power that way. So you don't want to underestimate their power. And academics and researchers like myself, we often figure out ways to support them with our research as well. So they're empowered with that, that extra armour that they need to speak the language of policymakers as well. So I think that's a really replenishing source of resiliency, because this can be a very draining, fatiguing process as well. Some people who work in the DEI space, diversity, equity and inclusion space, do suffer from compassion fatigue or emotional labour. It can be very rewarding, but it can also be very draining. So you want to be investing in ways to replenish and restore that energy as well. I think, too, one final thing about the resiliency, I think this notion of, women on their own and this, we have to fix women versus fix the system. If we get the system right and we devise the system, then you can sort of set it and let it become self-fulfilling in a way. And so there's less of that, ongoing fight. But it is about setting up the system to have measures of accountability in there and vigilance, I would say. So accountability mechanisms are really an act of vigilance to make sure you don't just assume the best of intentions and then the manager leaves and there's a change of personnel or change of government and we're rewinding back again. And then we spend so much time getting back up to where we were previously. So that's draining. And I think sometimes the leaders at hand know that and they're like, well, the women's groups will just stay busy. We'll keep them busy with all of that. But setting up systems which can't be undone, whether through legislation or mandates or accountability, is incredibly important so that you have those levers of vigilance in the system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. That's all we have time for with questions. However, Leonora has very generously offered to answer questions in the foyer for lunch. So if you do have a burning question, please feel free to go up to Leonora. So thank you so much, Leonora, again. I really appreciate you being here and for your generous answers to your questions. I'll just hand back to Michael before we close.
Thanks, Leonora. That was really wonderful, and I think about some of the challenges to my own thinking. And one of the things I've really taken out of today is I have a sort of a fairly black and white belief that part of our problem is when you've got privilege, the journey to equality can feel like discrimination, which is a fairly sort of black and white statement and a great soundbite, but it doesn't necessarily take us to where we need to go. It's a rather fatalistic description of where we are. So to have a series of steps to move beyond that and make us a more inclusive society as well as a sector is really important. That's the end of today's formal proceedings. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Leonora, Minna, fantastic work as always. We'll have lunch will continue on in the foyer, so if you'd like to join us for some conversations, and Minna said Leonora will be there. But in the meantime, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you at the next one.